This episode, we move away from the Americas to set our gaze back out east. We will first explore Central Asia and the Indian Subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and beyond to Oceania, and finally Africa. What do all these locations have in common? They were all targets of what became known as New Imperialism. This wasn't the same as the colonial structure of old, which died out with the declining Spanish Empire. Instead of European ships arriving to trade their gold and silver for spices, this imperialism was driven by industrialization and the extraction of raw materials. If you'd like some background on these themes, check out the Age of Discovery video from our last megadocumentary, where we go over the beginnings of European colonial expansion in some of the regions we'll talk about today. The shift began as a result of the Industrial Revolution, which required an abundance of resources from abroad. There were different motivations for the push for imperialism. For the French, which had a tumultuous long 19th century with constant revolutions and war, imperialism was seen as a way to anchor itself as one of the great European powers, lest it fall into obscurity. For Britain, the main center of the Industrial Revolution, many imperialists adopted a stance of social Darwinism, survival of the fittest, but with human societies. Many believed the great civilizations of the past were built upon the bones of those inferior, and that it was just the natural way of the world. Others still justified imperialism as a moral obligation, and the expansion and spread of Christianity, democracy, and capitalism was simply a gift to those less civilized. Apart from European powers, the United States engaged in its own imperialist endeavors, which we spoke about last time, as well as the Japanese, which we will cover next episode. The colonial system was often done through indirect rule, where local rulers cooperated with imperialist powers. This was the case in many parts of Africa, the Indian Subcontinent, and the Malay Peninsula. If there was resistance, though, imperialist powers would overthrow the governing body and establish direct rule, like in Algeria, the Dutch East Indies, and Vietnam. When we last left the Indian Subcontinent, the British East India Company had achieved victory in the Bengal and against the Marathas and Kingdom of Mysore. After the French gave up their claims in the region, the EIC was the dominant power. The Mughal emperor, once dominant in the early modern, remained only a figurehead in Delhi with nominal authority, his true power limited. The British East India Company controlled much of India either directly or through subsidiary alliances with local rulers. During the 1800s, the British implemented various reforms across the subcontinent, some of which by consequence improved the life of those upper-class Indians. A new school system was established, and later, a postal service and telegraph system. The first railway in India was inaugurated on April 16, 1853, covering a distance of 34 kilometers, about 21 miles, between Bombay and Thane. Industrialization increased with the opening of textile mills, but trade remained uneven, benefiting the British. The British also cracked down on the wandering gangs of Thuggee bandits and abolished the practice of sati, in which a widow would be made to sacrifice herself on her deceased husband's funeral pyre. To simplify the process of revenue collection in the vast and diverse territories under British control, a class of landowners known as zamindars became responsible for collecting taxes from the peasants who worked the land. They were required to pay a fixed annual tax to the British East India Company. In return, they could retain the surplus revenue, but they were also responsible for any shortfall. This system incentivized zamindars to increase agricultural production, but also led to widespread exploitation of peasants, as zamindars often resorted to high rents and harsh measures to ensure their own profits and meet the fixed revenue demands. British women's arrival in larger numbers during the 19th century led to the establishment of more defined racial and social barriers, as the British aimed to recreate a version of British society in India in line with Victorian morals and values. By 1857, the British grip on India was both formidable and unyielding. But in the dusty garrison town of Meerut, there was unrest among the ranks of the native soldiers serving under the British East India Company's banner. These Indian soldiers were known as sepoys. They were fueled by the heavy-handed policies of annexation, the disrespectful treatment of local rulers, and the introduction of new military practices that clashed with the sepoys' religious beliefs. The spark that ignited the powder keg was the introduction of the new Enfield rifle. Rumors spread like wildfire among the sepoy ranks that the cartridges for the rifle were greased with cow and pig fat, substances abhorrent to the Hindu and Muslim soldiers for religious reasons. To load the rifle, sepoys had to bite off the end of the cartridge, an act that would defile them. Despite protests, the concerns of the sepoys were dismissed by their British commanders, a mistake that would soon prove costly. On the 10th of May, 1857, the resentment turned into open rebellion. The sepoys of Meerut rose up against their British officers, unleashing a fury that had accumulated over years of subjugation. The revolt quickly spread across the northern and central parts of India, engulfing cities such as Delhi, where the aged Mughal emperor and esteemed poet, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was proclaimed the leader of the rebellion, symbolizing the desire to restore India's past. But lack of coordination among the Indian provinces and tensions between the Hindu and Muslim populations gave the advantage to the British. The East India Company's vengeance was swift and merciless, aimed at quelling the uprising with all means necessary, and with superior military tactics and reinforcements from back home, they gradually regained control. The capture of Delhi in September 1857 marked the turning of the tide, and by mid-1858, the rebellion had been largely suppressed. The aftermath of the rebellion was a turning point in Indian history. The British Crown took direct control of India from the East India Company, ushering in a new era of British imperialism on the subcontinent, the British Raj. The Mughal Empire, though in decline for decades, was dissolved. Reforms were introduced to address some of the grievances that had fueled the uprising, and efforts were made to win back the loyalty of the Indian people. With the British Crown in direct control, they reformed the military, relying more on those soldiers loyal to the British, like the Sikhs from the Punjab, and the Gurkhas, Nepali-speaking Indians from the Himalayas. Despite reforms, the scars of the rebellion ran deep, giving rise to a nationalism that would eventually lead to India's struggle for independence. India remained the jewel of the crown, and the British Empire spared no effort to protect its prized possession from potential threats. But in Central Asia, Russia was gradually expanding its territory and influence. In response to the perceived Russian threat, Britain sought to strengthen its borders in India and extend its own influence into Afghanistan and Iran, aiming to create buffer states between India and the advancing Russian Empire. This rivalry became known as the Great Game. Afghanistan became a central battleground. The British engaged in several Anglo-Afghan wars to establish a friendly and stable regime that could resist Russian advances, but resistance was too strong and the British were hampered by difficult terrain. Nonetheless, the Emirate of Afghanistan and Qajar Iran were increasingly encroached upon by the British and Russians respectively. Both empires sent spies and diplomats to map terrain, forge alliances with local rulers, and gather intelligence in a subversive dance of espionage. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 is often cited as the end of the Great Game, an agreement that resolved many territorial disputes and allowed both empires to maintain a united front against a more pressing issue in Europe, the increased aggression of Germany. Nearby, in Southeast Asia, colonization efforts continued. By the start of our timeline in 1800, Southeast Asia was still relatively free of European colonization, with only the Philippines under the Spanish, the Dutch in the East Indies, who had taken over from the Dutch East India Company in 1799, and the Portuguese in Timor. But while the British were consolidating power in the subcontinent, they also warred with neighboring Burma. When we last left Burma, current-day Myanmar, it was under the control of the Tungu Empire, which at its peak was the most powerful Southeast Asian empire. But constant rebellion weakened the empire, and in 1740, the Mon, the indigenous Austroasiatic people of the region, restored their own kingdom, and by 1752 overthrew the Tungu Empire, establishing themselves in Lower Burma. But the Burmese, under the Konbaung dynasty, went to war with the Mon kingdom and annexed their territory by 1757. The Konbaungs remained a powerhouse in the region, constantly warring with the Siamese in Ayutthaya, leading to its collapse, and fending off invasions from the Qing to the north. The Konbaung dynasty itself was eventually defeated by the British in a series of 3 Anglo-Burmese wars, leading to the complete annexation of Burma by the British Empire in 1885, when it was added to British India under direct rule. By this time, the British had also come to control Malaya, part of the Malay Peninsula, and Singapore, giving them access to the important Strait of Malacca and later northern Borneo, after treaties with the Dutch. Britain's sudden expansion in key areas of South and Southeast Asia frightened longtime rivals France. They looked to Vietnam, which already had a presence of French missionaries. We last left Vietnam during our last series, during the reign of Quang Trung of the Tay Son dynasty, who restored prosperity to Vietnam after civil war. But Quang Trung's heir wasn't as capable a leader, and one of the exiled Nguyen lords regained power with the help of a French missionary. In 1802, the Nguyen dynasty was established under Emperor Ya Laon, and by 1804, he had Dai Viet's name changed to Vietnam, symbolizing the unification of the North and South. Under Napoleon III, the Second French Empire launched a campaign in 1858, with the help of Spain, and set up a colony in the Mekong River Delta in southern Vietnam in 1862, called French Cochin China. By the end of the century, the French had established control over all of Vietnam, and the neighboring Cambodia and Laos, forming French Indochina. As their main economic interest was in the south, they established direct rule there, while Tonkin in the north and Annam in the central region were made into protectorates, with the emperor retaining nominal authority. Cambodia and Laos were also placed under indirect rule. The Kingdom of Ayutthaya had collapsed to the Burmese in 1767 and broke into 5 warring states. But Siam was soon reunified by Taksin the Great of the Thonburi Kingdom. In 1782, amidst growing concerns about King Taksin's rule and his alleged insanity, a palace coup was orchestrated. His friend and military leader Tongduang took the throne on April 6, 1782, marking the beginning of the Ratanakosin Kingdom and the Chakri dynasty, which continues to rule Thailand to this day. He established his capital across the river from Thonburi and took the regnal name of King Rama I, the beginning of a new golden age for Thailand. There, he ordered the construction of the Grand Palace and Temple of the Emerald Buddha, signifying the establishment of Bangkok as the new capital. The move to Ratanakosin also symbolized a fresh start for the kingdom, distancing it from the brief yet turbulent reign of King Taksin. Rama's reign focused on consolidating his power, reforming the administration, compiling the legal codes, and promoting religion and culture, laying the foundations for the modern Thai state. He also continued the defense of Siam against Burmese aggression, securing the kingdom's independence and sovereignty. Under later rulers, Rama IV and his son, Rama V, Siam kept Western powers from invading through a series of treaties, opening up their ports and liberalizing foreign trade. Through the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, Siam became more westernized, as European styles mixed with their art and culture, and the upper classes received a European-styled education. By 1900, Siam's diplomacy had kept it as the only independent Southeast Asian state. Both the surrounding French and English acknowledged Siam as a buffer state between British India and French Indochina. By the end of the century, the United States also entered Southeast Asia, supplanting the Spanish in the Philippines. From Southeast Asia, the British shipped out teakwood from Burma for shipbuilding and luxury furniture, and rubber from Malaya for the burgeoning new automobile industry. In Indochina, the French exported rice from the Mekong River Delta in southern Vietnam, and coal from the north. The Dutch continued exporting spices from the Moluccas, along with coffee and palm oil. The Portuguese on Timor focused on sandalwood, valued for its scent and medicinal uses. Despite being there for the raw materials, some Western powers justified occupation as what was popularized by the turn of the century as the white man's burden, a moral obligation to civilize those deemed less civilized, similar to the concept of manifest destiny from last episode. Some cities grew and modernized, like Saigon in Indochina, but it was mostly only the upper classes who profited. The common native citizen did not benefit from the educational reforms, and the middle-class merchants often had less opportunities, as trade became not only controlled by the Europeans, but many markets came under the control of wealthy Indian or Chinese merchants. Though a new urban culture emerged, most still worked as agricultural laborers. Many worked for European plantation owners for poverty wages. A consequence of colonial rule was that sanitation and infrastructure increased, resulting in a stark decrease in child mortality and a population surge. Many peasant families, who usually had many children to offset early death, grew so large that many had to relocate to the larger cities to work in the new factories, forming a class of urban poor. Still, as more were born, more came into poverty, as the economic wealth was extracted for the benefit of the mother nation back in Europe, and workers had to go through all the hardship of the new factory life and industrial revolution as in Europe, but without any of the rights or liberties. Peasant revolts and anti-colonial movements became common. In Burma, nationalist movements sprang up around the turn of the century, like the YMBA. By the 1930s, the first large insurrection against the government took place with the Sayasan Rebellion. It was a major peasant uprising against British rule, led by Sayasan, a physician and former monk who declared himself king. Although the rebellion was crushed, it highlighted the widespread discontent with British economic policies and inspired later nationalist movements. In Indochina, after being dethroned by the French in a coup, Emperor Hanyi fled to the mountains of central Vietnam, from where he issued the Canving Edict, calling on the people of Vietnam to rise up against the French occupiers. The movement brought together various segments of Vietnamese society, spearheaded by scholars, along with peasant support. It involved guerrilla warfare and represented a broad-based resistance against French colonialism. One of the most notable leaders of the insurgency was Phan Dinh Phung, a Confucian scholar who led several successful engagements against French forces in central Vietnam. The movement faced strong military retaliation from the French, who deployed substantial resources to suppress the uprising. The movement was gradually weakened by French military campaigns, internal divisions, and eventually, the capture of Emperor Hanyi in 1888, who was then exiled to Algeria. Further south, British explorers, most notably Captain James Cook, undertook extensive voyages, mapping many islands in the Pacific and claiming eastern Australia for Britain in 1770. Following the loss of the American colonies after the American War of Independence, Britain needed a new location to relieve overcrowded prisons in Britain and to establish a strategic base in the Pacific region. The First Fleet, carrying convicts, soldiers, and settlers, arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788, but soon relocated to Port Jackson to establish the first European settlement on the continent, named New South Wales. Captain Arthur Phillip was the colony's first governor. Over the following decades, additional settlements were established across the continent, including in Tasmania, then known as Van Diemen's Land, Western and South Australia, Victoria, Queensland, and the Northern Territory. The colonization process involved the exploration and mapping of the continent, claiming land for agriculture and settlement. The arrival of Europeans had a devastating impact on indigenous Australians, including displacement, introduction of diseases, and violent conflicts over land. Indigenous populations were significantly reduced and dispossessed of their land without treaty negotiations. The British expanded their influence in Oceania, annexing New Zealand in 1840 through the Treaty of Waitangi, and later establishing control over Fiji in 1874 and parts of Papua New Guinea. France also established a presence in the Pacific. French explorers, such as Louis-Antoine de Bougainville and Jean-François de Galaup, made significant voyages. France took control of various territories including New Caledonia in 1853, and Tahiti became the center of the French establishments in Polynesia. Germany annexed parts of Papua New Guinea and several island groups, including the Marshall Islands. The Hawaiian Islands were first visited by Europeans in the late 18th century, with Captain James Cook arriving in 1778. Throughout the early 19th century, Hawaii became a strategic stop for whaling ships, traders, and missionaries from Europe and the United States. The influence of these groups, especially American missionaries, grew over time. After years of conflict, King Kamehameha I unified the islands under his rule by 1810. The Kingdom of Hawaii entered into treaties with various countries and became an important center for the Pacific whaling industry, sugar production, and trade. But the growing influence of American and European settlers, especially in the economic sphere, led to increasing control over Hawaiian lands and politics, and in 1898, Hawaii was officially annexed by the United States. In Africa, European intervention had been limited. Apart from the initial small-scale raids into the interior during the 1500s, traders later mainly dealt with African rulers on the coast. By the 1800s, the transatlantic slave trade was in decline, as more states took measures to abolish slavery, which included both legal measures and active enforcement. This helped suppress the slave trade itself, but slavery continued in many major states until the mid-1800s, being abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s and the French colonies by 1848. The Brazilian Empire was the last Western power to abolish slavery in 1888. In West Africa, with humans off the market, trade in other goods gained prominence. Gold remained a major export, joined by peanuts to produce oil, palm oil for soaps and cooking, ivory for piano keys, and timber for shipbuilding and furniture. With the decline of the Portuguese Empire, the British and French established their own settlements along the coast. Sierra Leone was established as a colony for freed slaves in 1787, and Freetown, the colony's capital, became a British Crown colony in 1808. Sierra Leone served as a base for the British Navy's West Africa Squadron, which was tasked with efforts to intercept illegal slave ships and suppress the transatlantic slave trade. The early 19th century also saw the British consolidate their influence on the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, primarily through trade. The British encroachment led to a series of wars with the Ashanti Empire and Akan people living further inland. The first conflict began as a result of Ashanti efforts to enforce their claims over territories that paid tribute to them, including areas under the influence of the British on the coast. The war was triggered by Ashanti incursions into coastal areas, and in 1824, Governor Charles McCarthy led an expedition against them. But he was defeated and killed in battle, and his head was reportedly used as a drinking cup by the Ashanti. The war ended in a stalemate, with no formal treaty signed. The Second War was a brief conflict primarily over the refusal of the Ashanti to recognize a treaty Britain had made with the Fante, a coastal people under Ashanti domination. The British launched a punitive expedition, but were forced to retreat due to disease and logistical issues, resulting in an inconclusive end to the conflict. The Third War began after the Ashanti invaded the British Protectorate of the Fante in 1873, following disputes over tribute and territory. The British, led by Sir Garnet Wolseley, launched a well-prepared expedition that reached Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, in January 1874. The Ashanti were defeated, and their capital was briefly occupied and looted. The Treaty of Fermanagh ended the war, with the Ashanti agreeing to British demands, including the payment of a large indemnity. The fourth conflict was sparked by the Ashanti refusal to abide by the terms of the treaty ending the Third War, particularly the stipulation forbidding them from deploying their army without British permission. The British Expeditionary Force quickly overran the Ashanti, facing minimal resistance, and Kumasi was occupied again. The war ended with the Ashanti king, Prempeh I, being captured and exiled, and the Ashanti Empire becoming a British protectorate. The final conflict, also known as the Ya Asantewaa War, was triggered by the British governor's demand for the symbolic and sacred golden stool, which represented the Ashanti nation's sovereignty. Ya Asantewaa, the Queen Mother of Ijisu, led the Ashanti in a rebellion against British rule. Despite initial successes, including the siege of the British fort at Kumasi, the uprising was suppressed by British forces. The war resulted in the formal annexation of the Ashanti Empire by the British Empire in 1902, incorporating it into the Gold Coast colony, and Ya Asantewaa and other leaders were exiled to the Seychelles. Despite the victory, the British never captured the Golden Stool, which remained hidden throughout the war. The French had been present in Senegal since the 17th century, focusing on trade, particularly in slaves, gum arabic, and later, peanuts. During the early 19th century, French control was consolidated in Senegal, serving as a base for further exploration and expansion into West Africa. Liberia was established by the American Colonization Society in 1822 as a settlement for freed African American and Caribbean slaves, and declared its independence in 1847, becoming Africa's first republic. The Americo-Liberians, descendants of these freed slaves, dominated the country's political, economic, and social systems, often at the expense of the indigenous African populations. The British and French also showed great interest in North Africa, and had for a while. The land of the pyramids had stood at the crossroads of 3 continents, and greater than any natural resource, Egypt was home to the small swampy isthmus between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Napoleon attempted to control the crucial region during his expedition in 1798, and even toppled the reigning Mamluks, but was eventually driven out after British interference. In the power vacuum, the Ottomans attempted to reassert control, while the Mamluks attempted to continue their centuries-long rule. But some Ottoman troops had been sent by the empire to oust the remaining French. One of the factions included an Albanian commander by the name of Muhammad Ali. After a drawn-out civil war between the 3 factions, Muhammad Ali was appointed as the Ottoman governor, or Wali of Egypt, and recognized as Pasha. Muhammad Ali implemented extensive agricultural reforms, transforming Egypt into a major cotton producer. This shift was partly inspired by the global demand for cotton, especially from industrial countries like Britain. He modernized the Egyptian army, introducing new training, conscription, and weaponry, partly based on European models. Muhammad Ali also reformed the administrative system to centralize power and improve efficiency, reducing the power of traditional elites and the influence of the Ottoman Empire over Egypt. Efforts were made to establish educational institutions, including schools and technical institutes, to support his modernization programs. Infrastructure improvements, such as the construction of canals and roads, facilitated economic growth. Muhammad Ali sought to expand his territory, engaging in military campaigns in the Sudan, Syria, and the Arabian Peninsula. His successful conquest of the Hijaz and Sudan extended Egypt's influence significantly. His expansionist policies led to conflict with the Ottoman Empire and European powers, notably in the Greek War of Independence and the Egyptian-Ottoman War. The latter saw Egyptian forces advance deep into Ottoman territory on the path to Istanbul itself, before European powers intervened to maintain the balance of power in the region. Muhammad Ali's ambitions in the Levant and control over the eastern Mediterranean trade routes alarmed Britain and France, leading to increased European intervention in Egyptian affairs. The Convention of London in 1840 forced Muhammad Ali to withdraw from most of his territorial gains, in exchange for hereditary rule over Egypt and Sudan, marking the beginning of the dynasty that would rule Egypt until the mid-1950s. His reign ended in 1848 after contracting tuberculosis, but Egypt was soon raised to a new rank, the Khedivate. The title Khedive was a rank introduced by the Ottoman Empire, a step above Pasha and granted to the Viceroy of Egypt. It signified a higher degree of autonomy while still acknowledging the sovereignty of the Ottoman Sultan. The title was first bestowed upon Ismail Pasha, a grandson of Muhammad Ali, in 1867 by the Ottoman Sultan Abdulaziz. During his reign, the construction of the Suez Canal by French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, that began in 1859, further increased European interest and involvement in Egypt, particularly that of France and Britain, who bought into the project by 1875. Its completion benefited Egypt very little and cost thousands of Egyptian laborers their lives, as well as putting the government into extreme debt. In 1881, an army revolt broke out against the Khedive and foreign intervention, but in 1882, Britain invaded Egypt under the pretext of stabilizing the country amidst the nationalist uprisings, marking the start of British occupation. But even greater revolts were brewing to the south, in Sudan. The revolt was led by Muhammad Ahmed, who proclaimed himself the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer of Islam, in 1881. He called for a jihad against the Egyptian government, criticizing its corruption and the influence of foreigners. The start of the Mahdi revolt. The Mahdi and his followers, known as Mahdists, quickly gained support among Sudanese factions discontented with Egyptian rule. They seized vast territories, including the significant capture of Khartoum in 1885, where the British Egyptian Governor-General Charles Gordon was killed. The revolt significantly weakened Egyptian control over Sudan. The British, concerned about the stability of the region and the safety of the Suez Canal, intervened militarily. General Herbert Kitchener led British and Egyptian forces to recapture Sudan, culminating in the decisive Battle of Omdurman in 1898. The Mahdi state was defeated, and Sudan came under direct British-Egyptian rule, called Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, which lasted until Sudan's independence in 1956. Back in Egypt, the British soon viewed the Khedive as increasingly hostile, and he was deposed for his pro-Ottoman positions after the start of World War I. To the west, the Ottomans still had nominal control of the rest of the North African coast, through the Regency of Algiers, Ottoman Tunisia, and Ottoman Tripolitania, what was known to Europe as the Barbary Coast. It was from here that corsairs and pirates launched raids throughout the Mediterranean and along the West African coast. In 1830, France invaded Algeria, with a desire to expand French territory and suppress piracy in the Mediterranean. By 1837, the French had solidified their control over coastal Algeria, and over the following decades, they expanded their control inland, fully annexing the territory and ending Ottoman influence there. It became a destination for hundreds of thousands of European settlers, whose descendants became known as the Pieds Noirs. Tunisia, under the rule of the Husainid dynasty, maintained a degree of autonomy as an Ottoman vassal state. But by the mid-19th century, Tunisia's strategic location and economic potential attracted European interest, particularly from France and Britain. The Bey of Tunisia attempted modernization and reforms through the introduction of the 1861 constitution, but these efforts led to increased debt and economic dependence on European powers. In 1881, France established a protectorate over Tunisia through the Treaty of Bardo, effectively bringing it under French control and significantly reducing Ottoman influence. Over in East Africa, slavery remained more common, particularly under the Omani Empire. The Omani Empire's involvement along the Swahili coast is a story of gradual expansion, with significant periods of influence starting in the 17th century, taking over from Portuguese hegemony. But the most notable period of Omani resurgence and consolidation of control in the region occurred during the 19th century under the rule of Said bin Sultan, who became Sultan of Oman in 1804. In the early 19th century, Said shifted his focus towards the island of Zanzibar off the coast, which became increasingly important due to its strategic location for trade, particularly in spices and slaves, and its potential for agricultural development. In 1832, Said officially moved his capital from Muscat, Oman, to Zanzibar, making it the center of his empire. Under the Sultan's rule, the influence of the Omani Empire extended over the Swahili coast, including parts of what are today Kenya and Tanzania, and further into the interior regions. After Sultan Said's death in 1856, his empire was divided between two of his sons. Tuwaini bin Said became the Sultan of Oman, and Majid bin Said became the Sultan of Zanzibar. But it was under their father's reign that Omani influence in East Africa reached its zenith, with Zanzibar becoming a wealthy trading hub and the cultural and economic center of the Swahili coast. The continued slave trade provoked European abolitionists, including the Scottish physician, missionary, and explorer David Livingstone. Livingstone was one of the first Europeans to undertake a transcontinental journey across Africa. After initial explorations in southern Africa, he undertook an expedition across the continent, from Luanda on the Atlantic coast to Quelimane, on the Indian Ocean near the mouth of the Zambezi River, exploring much of interior Africa previously unknown to Europeans. While searching for the source of the Nile, Livingstone is credited with the discovery of numerous geographical features, most famously Victoria Falls in 1855, which he named after Queen Victoria. His detailed observations also added substantially to Western knowledge of African geography, flora, fauna, and the social organization of the African societies he encountered. Livingstone promoted the three C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization, and was a fervent opponent of the slave trade. He helped raise awareness in Britain and around the world to its atrocities, and in 1873, under pressure from Britain, the Zanzibar slave market was officially closed, and slavery was abolished by the end of the century. So far, we've looked at Central, West, Northern, and Eastern Africa, but it was the South which had the most complex and unique interactions with Europeans. The Dutch VOC had established Cape Colony at the Cape of Good Hope in the mid-1600s, and their descendants became known as Boers. The colony remained Dutch-controlled until the Napoleonic Wars, when the British seized it at the Battle of Blouberg, with the Dutch giving up its claims in 1814. There were increased tensions between the Dutch and English from the start, but once the British abolished slavery in their empire in the 1830s, it sparked a mass exodus called the Great Trek, as many Boer migrants, called voortrekkers, migrated northward via wagon train. But moving further inland brought them into conflict with a formidable African kingdom. This kingdom was founded in 1816 by King Shaka Zulu, who reigned from its inception until 1828. As the leader of the Zulu kingdom, he transformed a relatively small group into a formidable and expansive empire through a combination of military innovation, strategic prowess, and ruthlessness. Shaka revolutionized Zulu warfare by popularizing the short stabbing spear, the Ikilwa, in place of the traditional throwing spear, emphasizing close combat effectiveness, although some scholars claim this change predated Shaka. He also reorganized the army into more disciplined and efficient units and regiments, called Impis, which were based on age groups but not lineage, breaking down traditional social structures to ensure loyalty to him personally. Through a series of military campaigns, Shaka significantly expanded the territory under Zulu control, absorbing or displacing many neighboring groups. His expansionist policies and military conquests led to the creation of a centralized state with a strong monarchy. Shaka fought against various groups and kingdoms in the region. The wars and displacements caused by Shaka's expansion contributed to the Mfecane, leading to widespread upheaval, the formation of new societies, and migrations across southern Africa. This period reshaped the demographic and political landscape, with effects reaching as far as present-day Zimbabwe and Malawi. Shaka was assassinated by his half-brothers, Dingane and Umhlanga, in 1828, amidst growing dissatisfaction with his rule, especially following the death of his mother, Nandi. His death led to succession struggles, with Dingane eventually becoming king. As the Boers expanded further northward in search of new lands, they came into conflict with the Ndebele in a series of encounters during the early to mid-19th century. The Ndebele, another Bantu group, were originally part of the Zulu kingdom but migrated north under the leadership of Mzilikazi, founding a new kingdom in what is now Zimbabwe. The most significant of these conflicts were the battles in 1837 and later conflicts in the 1840s. The wars with the Zulu culminated in the Battle of Blood River, where a Voortrekker commando group, led by Andries Pretorius, decisively defeated a large force of Zulu warriors. This battle was a turning point in the Great Trek, leading to the establishment of the Natalia Republic by the Boers, although it was later annexed by the British. But their other established Boer republics, the Orange Free State and Transvaal, became officially recognized and remained throughout the 1800s. The Khoisan, who lived in the area well before even the Bantu speakers, also resisted the Boers seizing their grazing land, but as time went on, the indigenous populations were slowly resettled on reservations. Though European presence significantly increased during the 1800s, it was nothing compared to what would occur during the final sliver of the century, as Africa went from this to this just a few years later. This was the Scramble for Africa. Before the Scramble, European presence in Africa was mostly limited to coastal trading posts engaged in commerce, including gold, ivory, spices, and slaves. Interior exploration was limited due to geographical barriers, diseases like malaria, and resistance from African societies. Improvements in navigation, built on the charts by David Livingstone and the Portuguese Serpa Pinto, steamships to master the African waterways, advances in medicine, notably quinine for malaria, and weaponry, like the Maxim gun, gave Europeans a significant advantage over local populations, facilitating deeper penetration into the African interior. By this time, there was intense national rivalries among European powers, particularly between the UK, France, Germany, and Belgium, which drove a competitive urge to acquire territories to enhance national prestige and power. The small kingdom of Belgium, under King Leopold II, was the first to take advantage. Henry Morton Stanley, an explorer and journalist, was secretly sent by Leopold to Central Africa to form treaties with numerous chiefs along the Congo River. By 1882, he had enough land to form the basis of the Congo Free State, privately owned by King Leopold himself. This gave him access to vast amounts of ivory, palm oil, and especially rubber. While work conditions on plantations were always harsh, they were particularly brutal under King Leopold. Forced labor, atrocious punishments, and mass killings were common. Sleeping sickness and smallpox also destroyed entire communities. Serving as the instrument of Leopold's control over this vast African territory, the Force Publique, a military and police force tasked with securing the state's economic interests, particularly in rubber and ivory, was responsible for most of the atrocities. It comprised an officer corps mainly of Europeans, and relied on Africans as soldiers and mercenaries. They were infamous for their brutal methods of enforcing labor and quelling dissent among the Congolese population, including the use of violence and mutilation. The shikot, a bullwhip, was the least of a worker's concern, as dismemberments were common, with severed hands and feet being used as trophies. Family members were forced to kill each other, as entire villages were burned. Cannibalism was officially outlawed, but it was allowed in certain cases among the soldiers, with one Belgian officer calling it horrible, but exceedingly useful and hygienic. In just over 20 years, the estimated population of 16 million was reduced by half, leading to international pressure to intervene. The British Casement Commission led the investigations in 1904, and by 1908, King Leopold was relinquished of the Congo Free State, and it came under the control of the government as the Belgian Congo. In the end, the camera turned out to be the only witness Leopold couldn't bribe. Nearby, the French also established themselves at Brazzaville, creating the smaller French Congo. Spurred by King Leopold's intervention in the Congo, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference in 1884, where European powers divided up the rest of the African continent among themselves in an effort to avoid war with one another. During the next couple of decades, Africa was either annexed or indirectly ruled by the Europeans, one piece at a time, their goal of avoiding confrontation with each other a success. From their base in Senegal, the French had conquered most of West Africa during the 1880s and 1890s against powerful states such as the Tukulur Empire, leading to the establishment of French Sudan, modern-day Mali. The Kingdom of Dahomey, in present-day Benin, was conquered in 1894, following several military expeditions. French control was established over the area of modern Guinea by the late 1890s. The French declared a protectorate over Côte d'Ivoire in 1843, but actual control over the interior was only established in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Upper Volta, present-day Burkina Faso, and Niger were gradually brought under French control, with significant resistance from local leaders. By the early 1900s, this was a federation of 8 colonies called French West Africa. From their base in the French Congo in Central Africa, the French also created a federation of 4 colonies called French Equatorial Africa. This region was also reportedly administered with similar atrocities as the Belgian Free State, with mutilations, executions, and human burnings, although on a smaller scale. The Berlin Conference helped Europeans avoid direct conflict with each other for over a decade. But France's ambitions were to create an empire from west to east, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea, while for the British, they dreamed of an empire from north to south. And it was at this intersection in 1898, at Fashoda in Sudan, that the British and French met, and it seemed war would be unavoidable. But the British army, backed up by the Egyptians, outnumbered the French almost 10-1, and after a standoff, the French backed down, their dreams of empire relegated to the west. In North Africa, apart from Algeria and Tunisia, France also had claims to Morocco, with the tacit approval of other European powers, including Britain. But Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm, twice undermined France's authority in the First and Second Moroccan crisis, putting European powers on the brink of war. Conflict was averted through diplomatic means, but it further worsened relations between France and Germany. In 1912, Sultan Abdelhafid signed the Treaty of Fez, establishing a French protectorate over Morocco. This treaty marked the official beginning of French colonial rule, although Spanish control over certain northern and southern regions was also recognized. Like the French, the Germans also had a presence in West and Central Africa, in today's Togo and Cameroon. They were more established in German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, where they subdued the native Herero in the Herero Wars, which led to mass genocide. In German East Africa, the region of Tanganyika, today's Tanzania, the Germans quelled a revolt by native Muslims and indigenous Africans, called the Magi Rebellion. Just to their north were the British protectorates of British East Africa and Uganda. The British also removed the Sultanate on the island of Zanzibar in as little as 38 minutes in the Anglo-Zanzibar War. To date, this was to be the shortest recorded war in all of history. The United Kingdom retained the most colonies on Africa by this point, holding 1/3 of the continent. Apart from the aforementioned Egypt, Sudan, and East Africa, they held colonies in what was collectively called British West Africa. But their most valuable and troublesome ventures would come in the south. Before the Scramble, this region was still home to the Zulu Kingdom, the 2 Boer republics, and the British Cape Colony. Diamonds were discovered further inland in 1867, but the discovery of diamonds on the farm of Nicholas and Diedrich de Beer near the present-day Kimberley initiated a full-scale diamond rush. Prospectors flooded the area, and several large diamonds were found, leading to the establishment of the Kimberley mine. The wealth generated by the diamond mines and the strategic importance of the region led to increased British interest and influence in the interior of southern Africa, leading to further tensions. the diamond mining industry quickly became dominated by powerful individuals like Cecil Rhodes, who founded De Beers Consolidated Mines in 1888, effectively gaining control over the diamond production in Kimberley and establishing a monopoly that would influence the global diamond market for decades to come. Rhodes dreamed of a massive project, the Cape to Cairo Railway, linking South Africa to Egypt. In reference to the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the concept was satirized as the Rhodes Colossus, depicting the entrepreneur as a giant holding a telegraph line, standing over Africa from Cairo to Cape. To avoid conflict, the British attempted to form a confederation with the Boers, modelled on that of the English and French provinces of the new nation of Canada, but the Boers refused. In 1877, the British officially annexed the Transvaal, despite having previously acknowledged its independence. It was met with little opposition, as the neighbouring Zulu remained a threat to the Boers, and financial mismanagement left Transvaal on the verge of bankruptcy if they were to remain independent. With the British in control, they expanded further to minimise the Zulu presence. It was around this time that the British dealt the final blow to the Xhosa, after several conflicts with the Bantu people. The Xhosa, after the Zulu, were the major ethnic group in South Africa. They engaged in a series of 9 different wars, spanning a century, against both the Boers and British Empire. After the 9th War, and the death of Chief Sandile, the Xhosa lands fell into British hands. The British invaded Zululand in January 1879 under the pretext of a dispute over the succession to the Zulu throne, along with British demands that were deliberately impossible for the Zulu King Cetshwayo to meet. The Anglo-Zulu War is renowned for the early Zulu victory at the Battle of Isandlwana, where the Zulu forces surrounded and decisively defeated the British Army. The defeat was so disastrous that the British lost more officers here than at the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon. Despite the setback, the British ultimately prevailed, culminating in the capture of King Cetshwayo and the annexation of the Zulu kingdom. After the threat was over, the Transvaal Boers, inspired that the British might not be as invincible as they once seemed, declared their independence and resisted British forces in the Boer War, or Transvaal Rebellion. The British significantly underestimated the fighting capabilities, motivation, and resilience of the rebel fighters. The Boers were skilled marksmen, familiar with the terrain, and utilized guerrilla tactics effectively against British forces. The Boer victory at the Battle of Majuba Hill in February 1881 led to the signing of a peace treaty and the Pretoria Convention. This agreement granted the Transvaal self-government under British suzerainty, marking a rare defeat for the British in their colonial conquests. Now, with German West Africa on one side and encroachment from the Transvaal on the other, the British government needed to prevent these groups from interrupting the land corridor between the British colonies in the south and north. Various Tswana leaders, the major ethnic group in the area, including Chief Khama III of the Bangwato, appealed to the British for protection against both the Boer encroachment and internal conflicts. In response to these concerns and to safeguard their strategic interests, the British declared Bechuanaland a protectorate in 1885, modern-day Botswana. British administration here was relatively light, as it was meant more as a buffer state rather than for settlement and development. But just a few years later, the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand Basin in Transvaal led to one of the largest gold rushes in history and the founding of Johannesburg, which grew rapidly as a result of the influx of prospectors and miners called Uitlanders. The Uitlanders, mainly British, resented their lack of political rights and representation in the Transvaal. Under Cecil Rhodes, who became Prime Minister of Cape Colony in 1890, and later British governments, there was a push for greater British influence and control in southern Africa, aiming to unite the region under British rule. The Uitlander grievances was to be their pretext for war. The Second Boer War was a much larger and more brutal conflict than the first, involving the British Empire against the 2 Boer republics, the South African Republic, or Transvaal, and the Orange Free State. It began with Boer offensives into British territories, leading to early Boer successes at Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking. But this time, the British responded with a large-scale military build-up. By February 1900, they had taken Bloemfontein, the capital of Orange Free State, and by June, Pretoria fell, the capital of the Transvaal. But guerrilla warfare continued for another 2 years under Louis Botha. The British response was quite brutal, with the relocation of over 100,000 Boers to what became the world's first concentration camps, where between 26,000 to 28,000 perished, mostly women and children. There were also camps for black Africans, which were kept in even worse condition. The war finally concluded in 1902, resulting in British victory and the annexation of both republics into the British Empire. The war had devastating effects on the Boer civilian population and marked the beginning of British dominance in southern Africa, laying the groundwork for the Union of South Africa in 1910, which merged the British Cape Colony and Natal with the two Boer republics to form a self-governing dominion similar to Canada and Australia at the time. To appease the Boers for their loss, the British only allowed voting rights to the white minority, which made up around 20% of the population. This laid the groundwork for the formal apartheid system introduced during the 1940s. Separate from the Union, remaining autonomous protectorates of Britain were Basutoland and Swaziland, present-day Lesotho and Eswatini. Under the leadership of King Moshoeshoe I, the Basotho people effectively resisted attempts, by both the Boers and the British, to conquer their territory in the early to mid-19th century, but became a British protectorate in 1868, at the request of the king. Swaziland, inhabited by the Swazi people, was primarily valuable for its mineral resources and as a buffer state between the British, Boers, and the Portuguese in Mozambique to the north. Similar to King Moshoeshoe, the Swazi monarch engaged in diplomacy to play European powers against each other, seeking protection while maintaining a level of sovereignty. Swaziland's economic value did not necessitate full annexation, and its role as a buffer was sufficiently served by making it a protectorate in 1902, after the Second Boer War. Further north, the British, under Cecil Rhodes' British South Africa Company, also established themselves in northern and southern Rhodesia, present-day Zambia and Zimbabwe. The British Central Africa Protectorate was established in 1891, which encompassed the area of present-day Malawi. The protectorate was renamed Nyasaland in 1907. While not one of the Big Four, Italy's foray into African colonization began in earnest in the last 2 decades of the 19th century, driven by a desire for fresh economic opportunities and to address their poverty and overpopulation problems. Italy's first significant colonial acquisition was in the Horn of Africa, where it purchased the Bay of Assab. From there they expanded inland, in military campaigns against the neighboring Ethiopian Empire. King Menelik II faced a war on 2 fronts, as the Mahdist uprising to the west seeped into Ethiopia, so a treaty was made with the Italians, and they officially established the colony of Eritrea in 1890. But the Italians failed in their colonial attempts in Ethiopia itself, as King Menelik and his army decisively defeated the invading Italian and Eritrean forces. Along with Liberia, these were the only 2 African states to maintain their independence. Italy also established a foothold in parts of what is now Somalia, signing treaties with local sultans in the 1880s and 1890s to gain control of the Benadir coast. The Italian Somalia colony was gradually expanded through further agreements and military action. In North Africa, Italy invaded Libya in 1911, and by 1912, through the Treaty of Lausanne, the Ottomans formally ceded it to Italy, ending over 3 centuries of Ottoman presence in the region. Pax Britannica, which translates to British peace, refers to the period of relative peace in the 19th and early 20th centuries, roughly 1815 to 1914, facilitated by the British Empire's global dominance and naval supremacy. During this era, Britain acted as a global policeman, enforcing free trade and addressing international disputes through its powerful Royal Navy, which helped maintain open and secure sea routes critical for commerce. This period saw significant economic globalization, technological progress, and the spread of British political and cultural influences worldwide, although it was also marked by colonial expansion and competition with other imperial powers. While this phase of imperialism was a brutal period for the native populations of Africa, there were also some positive consequences, like improved infrastructure and efforts to control disease. But the period of new imperialism will still forever be known for its exploitation of natural resources and human labor, cultural suppression, and new systems of racial hierarchy and segregation which would last well into the 20th century, altering the life of millions. In the midst of these colossal shifts, the decline of once mighty empires like the Ottomans signaled a changing order. The weakening of the sick man of Europe was a foreshadowing for those empires of the past, as imperialist ambition and competition also cast a shadow over the Qing in the Far East. The next stop on our journey